Welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is the second episode in a three-part series on elemental etymology. Essentially what we're doing in this series is we are going through the names of all 118 elements on the periodic table and examining where their names come from. In the first part of this series, we looked at the first 25 elements because they are really some of the most common ones, and so we had a special focus on them. In this episode, we're going to look at the next elements after the first 25, but we're going to take a little bit of a bigger bite and go over some of them pretty quickly, but I'm going to pull out some of the more common and well-known ones and spend some time on them kind of like we did in the last episode, all right? So these elements are kind of in the middle of the periodic table. Again, they are literally right in the middle from 26 to 73. You will have heard of some of these, even if you are not a scientist or a chemist, but some of them will probably be news to you unless you are in fact a specialist in chemistry. So this is a mix of well-known and obscure elements, and it's also a mix of etymological sources, just like we saw with the first 25 elements in the last episode. Now, the mix is going to actually be a little more diverse than last time. We're going to have some of the same sources that we saw in the first episode, and then we're going to have a few extra sources as well. So the breakdown of these elements here is that 12 are named for a particular property that they had. You remember that that was one of the most common sources of names for elements in the first 25 elements. 12, another 12, are named for a well-known source or compound. You'll remember that this was the most common source of names for the first 25 elements. So you can see that these two sources are still very well represented as we continue to move through the periodic table. 14 are named for a region of origin. This was something that we saw with a few elements in the first 25, but we're going to see that this really explodes when we get to the middle of the periodic table, and this becomes a pretty common reason that elements got named. Then 4 are named for mythological figures, and 3 are named for similarities to other elements, not necessarily anything about themselves, but just they are similar to another element, and so they got a name that was similar to another element or harkens back to it. And then finally, we're going to see that in this set, 3 elements, 3 pretty well-known elements that I think you will have heard of, have etymologies that are more or less lost to history. So we're going to talk about those at the end of this episode. So let's dive in. Kind of like last time, we're going to take the elements not in the order that they're found on the periodic table, like 26 on to 73, but rather we're going to take them in the order that you see here listed on your screen. We're going to take them in order of why they were named and their source. Okay, so we're going to start with the 12 that were named for a property, and then we're going to move on to the 12 that were named for a well-known source, and then the ones that are named for a region of origin, and then mythological figures, elements named was for similarities, and then finally those 3 at the end whose etymologies are unclear. So let's get started. Elements that are named for a particular property. We're going to start with iron here. Iron is element number 26, so it's actually the very first one we're going to talk about, and also the first one on the periodic table in this middle section. The name iron goes way back to Proto-Germanic, so this is not a word that we borrowed from Greek or Latin or any other source. We saw even in the first 25 elements that most of the names had been borrowed from Greek or Latin. There were very few native Germanic names on there, but this is going to be another one of the relatively small handful of element names that do come from our inherited Germanic past and that we didn't borrow from Greek, Latin, or some other source. So our word iron goes all the way back to Old English, and then before that to its ancestor Proto-Germanic. Now this form in Proto-Germanic was something like isern. There was a process called rhoticism that happened between Proto-Germanic and Old English, whereby the S became a Z, and then that Z became an R. So that S in isern is actually the R that we have in iron today, and that's actually a pretty common process in the older history of English. So we think that this comes from an Indo-European root that means strong or holy. So what this name probably meant originally was the strong metal. It may have had connotations of holiness as well, because this word can also have connotations of holiness. As far as the symbol Fe, that goes back to the Latin name for iron, which is why it looks nothing like the Germanic name for iron, because the Latin name was ferrum. We still have ferro things with 2 R's where it has something to do with iron, and that word is borrowed from the Latin word for iron, which as you can see is ferrum with 2 R's, and that is where the symbol Fe comes from. What about zinc? Zinc is number 30 on the periodic table. This is actually a borrowing from a German word, so it's not a native inheritance from our Germanic past, but we borrowed it from the German language within the past few hundred years. It comes from the German word Zink. Z's in German are more like a sound. So Zink, which probably comes from a normal German word Zinke, which means prong or point or spike. So essentially what zinc means, it's the spiky element. It's the element characterized by spikes because when it is created or made or smelted from other sources like ores or compounds, it has spikes in it. Again, I'm not a chemist, I've never seen this myself, but this is what people say, and this is apparently how the element got its name. It's the spiky element, so that's a pretty cool name once you know about it. What about bromine? Bromine does go back to the Greek language. It just comes from this normal Greek word bromos that means stench, because apparently bromine smells bad. So literally bromine just means the element that smells bad. That's all that element means. What about iodine? Iodine is from two Greek words, io, which means violet, and it actually comes from the name of a flower that happens to be purple, and eides, which means looking. We have talked about this eides morpheme or word in some prior safaris, so I'm going to put a link up here if you want to go check out other words that we have in English today that have this eides element going all the way back to Greek. So when you put those two together, io eides, you get a word that means something like it looks purple, because as it turns out, iodine looks purple in its natural form. So really, iodine just means the purple element. That's actually all that means. Of course, we use iodine and we talk about it, needing to get it in our diet and things like that. It doesn't dye your teeth purple. It doesn't make your tongue purple, as far as I know, but nonetheless, it is known as the purple element. Let's briefly run over some other elements that are named for a property. Again, I pulled out those four because those are four elements that you are probably well familiar with. You may not be as familiar with some of these other elements that we are going to go over a little bit more quickly on this list, but they are named for a property. Element number 36 is krypton. This just comes directly from an ancient Greek word krypton, which means hidden, because this is one of the noble gases, kind of like neon and argon that we talked about in the last safari. The noble gases were discovered fairly late. They are difficult to synthesize because there aren't many of them. There isn't much of them in the atmosphere and hiding or lying on Earth. And so that was why this particular one got its name krypton, just like neon got its name because it was a new element that had to be found later, because it wasn't easy to find. So also krypton, another noble gas, got its name because it was sort of lying there hidden and we had to find it fairly late in the game. Rubidium comes from a Latin word that just means red, because there are some red associations with this element. Technetium comes from the Greek word technetos, which means crafted. I probably don't need to tell you that all of our technos and technology words come from this ancient Greek root as well that has something to do with craftsmanship or creating something with skill. So technetium was given its name because it was the first element to be created artificially, and so it kind of makes sense that it was given this name. Indium actually just comes from the name of the color indigo, which you are probably familiar with. It looks like it comes from the name of the country India. It doesn't, but indirectly it does, because the color indigo ultimately comes from the country India, because our color indigo goes back to a Latin word indicum, which was just an adjective in Latin that meant Indian, or coming from India or the Indian subcontinent. So apparently dyes of that color were sourced from the Indian subcontinent in ancient times, and so it got the name the Indian color, and the element indium is named after the Indian color. Xenon is yet another one of these noble gases, just like krypton and neon and argon, and it was again also discovered fairly late in the game and given this name xenon in Greek, which just means strange or foreign, because once again, it's not an element you are going to come across very often, and so that's why it was given the name. It's basically the weird element, the strange element, or something like that. Cesium, or sometimes spelled with an A there, comes from a Latin color word caesium, which means sky blue. Again, that's a color that is associated with this element. Lanthanum is particularly interesting because it doesn't come from a color or even a noun. It actually comes from a verb in ancient Greek. This verb, lanthano, in ancient Greek means to escape notice or to lie hidden. It can be a word that you can use if you're speaking speaking ancient Greek to talk about forgetting things. Something has escaped your notice or whatever. So this element was named lanthanum because it escaped people's notice for a long time. It's another one of these elements that had to be discovered, and it was discovered fairly late in the game, and apparently the person who isolated it decided that it deserved this name lanthanum because it had escaped his notice for so long, and so he called it the element that had escaped his notice and apparently everyone else's. Kind of along the same lines, the element dysprosium comes from the Greek adjective dysprositone, which means hard to get. The dys part means hard, the pros means toward, and the it part means to access or get to or go to. Pros, it together means to go to or to access, really. So dys means unable, the pros, it means access, and the own kind of makes it a noun or an adjective. So it's the inaccessible element. That's actually what this element's name means. So again, all of these are elements that, you may not have heard of. They're not some of the most common elements that we talk about, but they were all named for some kind of property. Now let's talk about some of those elements that were named for some kind of source. How about cobalt? Cobalt is number 27. So again, we're kind of going back to the beginning of the section we're looking at here. The interesting thing about cobalt is that it comes from a German word. We've already seen an element that just comes straight from a German word, not in our Germanic past, but we borrowed it from the German language within the past few hundred years. This actually comes from a German word you probably wouldn't expect. That German word is kobold, which means goblin in the German language. You might be like, okay, why was this element named after a word for goblin in another language? As it turns out, there was a particular ore that was found in German-speaking regions that miners called the goblin ore, and the reason they called it the goblin ore was because they were having difficulty getting useful metals out of it, and when they would smelt it, it smelled bad, and it made them sick because, as it turned out, it had a lot of arsenic in it. We're going to get to arsenic here in a little bit. But later on, they found out that it also had another element in it, and that element they named cobalt after the particular ore that it was found commonly in, at least at the time. So that is how this particular element got the name goblin, not because it's a particularly goblin-y element, but because its primary source, or the source that it was originally discovered in and sourced from, had the name goblin ore for some specific reasons. Going along with that very same theme is the next element on the periodic table, nickel. Nickel also comes from a German word that's not necessarily very positive. It comes from the German word nickel, which means demon, essentially, translated into English, but this is a shortened form of a longer compound in German, which is Kupfernickel, which means copper demon. You can see Kupfer, copper kind of looks similar, so that's the same word, all right? Kind of like the last thing we were just talking about with cobalt, this doesn't say anything that, that there's anything demonic about the element nickel, but rather it was sourced from a particular ore that got this particular negative sounding name, and the reason it got this particular negative sounding name is because it looked like an ore that you could smell copper out of, but when these miners tried to smelt copper out of it, they didn't get any copper. So they named it Copper Demon because it looks like it's a demon that's just fooling with you and trying to make you think there's really copper in it, but there's not. Later on, when they found out that there was a particular element in it, they just named it demon, not because there's anything demonic about it, but because it was originally sourced from this particular ore. And that's actually where the name nickel comes from. Pretty cool. Of course, now this word has sort of gained a lot of other connotations. It's a unit of currency in the United States. The 5-cent piece is called the nickel. I certainly didn't know before I started looking into this that our 5-cent piece in the United States is called the demon coin. Very interesting. Okay, let's move on to arsenic. I know you have heard of arsenic. This one has a particularly interesting etymology. Where does this name arsenic come from? Well, it comes from Greek, fairly late in the game, not classical Greek, but a little bit later on. The Greeks got this word arsenic. It's arsenikon in Greek. You can see it's very similar to our word in English. In Greek, in the Greek language, arsenikon means manly or masculine or something like that. So you might be wondering what's manly or masculine about arsenic. I'm sure we could make a connection somewhere if we wanted to about assassinations or I don't know what. But that's actually not really where the name comes from. There was a process called folk etymology where the Greeks actually got this word from people further to the east, and they thought it sounded like their word for manly, and so they just changed it enough to make it the actual word for manly, but that's not where the word comes from. We have to keep tracing it a little further back to understand where the roots of the word arsenic lie. So in the Greek language, this word was a borrowing from Syriac, which is a Semitic language spoken in the Middle East. And in Syriac, it was al zarnika. Al is just the article, the definite article. In Syriac, this meant the Zarnica. It wasn't an original part of the word. You can see how the Greeks kind of mangled all Zarnica to arsenicon to make it look a little more, well, manly, I guess, but that wasn't the original form of the word. So in Syriac, it means the Zarnica, but that Zarnica word was actually a borrowing from even further east, the Persian language, because in the Persian language, there was a word zarnik that means golden. So apparently, arsenic was oftentimes originally sourced from ores that were yellow, even though arsenic is not actually a yellow element. Oftentimes it would be found in ores that were combined with sulfur, and sulfur is a yellow element, and so it got to be known as the golden element, or really not necessarily the golden element, but simply an element known from a golden compound. This is sort of a fine line that I'm making between elements that are known for a particular property and elements that are known for a particular property of a source. Again, if it was a property, I would have talked about it earlier when we were talking about elements that are known for a particular property, but this is actually named not after its own property, but the property of a particular source that it was often sourced from. So keep that Persian word zarnik in mind. That word zar in Persian means golden. We're going to see it here with the next element as well, which is also named after a property of a source, not a property of the element itself. The element zirconium is named after its primary compound, zircon, and that word comes from the Persian word zargun, which means gold-like, and you can see that zar there again. So zar, that one Persian word that means gold, is actually sort of at the foundation of both the word arsenic and the word zirconium. And at the end of the day, they both sort of mean the same thing. Arsenic is sourced from a particular golden compound, and zirconium is sourced from a particular golden compound or mineral. So they really kind of mean the same thing, even though they are very different elements. Once again, let's run through some other elements in this series that were named for a particular source, or maybe the property of a particular source. Rhodium is a good example of that. This word comes from the Greek word rhodon, which meant rose, because apparently the compound that this was sourced from was kind of a light pink color, and so it was given the name the rose element. But once again, it's not a rose element, but the compound it was sourced from has a light pink color, and that's where it got the name. Cadmium comes from the Latin word cadmia or cadmia, which we often translate calamine today. Again, if you're a chemist, you might know about that. Otherwise, you might not. It's a zinc ore, okay? It's a place that you can get zinc from, but apparently there are quantities of this other element that were later discovered in it, and the element was named after that particular ore, all right? That ore, in turn, goes all the way back to ancient Greek times, and in ancient Greek times, it was named after a mythological figure, Cadmus, who was the mythological founder of the city of Thebes, not the one in Egypt, but the one in Greece. Apparently, this ore was sourced from that particular part of Greece, and so it was given the name the Cadmean ore, or the Cadmean earth, because it came from that part of Greece, and ultimately that's where we get the name of this element from. Tellurium actually just comes from the Latin word, or one of the Latin words, tellus, which means earth. There were multiple words for earth in Latin, but this is a pretty common one, tellus, all right? So all of our words like telluride ultimately come from this particular word in Latin, often through this particular element. Again, this is a pretty generic one. It was sourced from the earth. You probably could have guessed that, but it was found in a gold mine, apparently, so deep in the earth, and that's why it was ultimately given the name the earthy metal, essentially, because I guess that's its source, the earth. Barium, again, comes from a particular compound that was named after a Greek word. That Greek word was barus, which means heavy. We get other bari words from this ancient Greek word that means heavy. So barium is named after the compound or ore or source that had this word that means heavy attached to it. The next two elements here actually go together. They are kind of twins. They are praseodymium and neodymium. Once again, I'm guessing that most of you haven't heard of these two elements because they are not really talked about. But here they go. They go together. They were sort of discovered together, and they were both discovered in a particular compound or ore that was named didymium. Didymium comes from the Greek word didymos, which means twin, okay? And it was called that because it was similar to some other elements that were around it in the periodic table. And so the discoverer of this ore thought that maybe it was a twin element that was next to it. He was kind of right, but as it turned out, it was a compound, not an element, and it ended up containing two different elements, and then he had to name those two elements something, and he named them both something with dimium because it came from this particular compound that was called didymium, because, again, for the reasons that I just said. He had to show that these were two elements and name them differently, so he named one of them praseodymium, which comes from a Greek word that means leek green. I guess it has kind of a green color to it, all right? And then neodymium, again, has this neon word that we saw in the element neon, because I guess maybe it was the second one he isolated, so it was the newer of the two. Now, again, you can kind of argue, if you want to nitpick a little bit, that praseodymium should actually have been on the previous list because it's being named for something about its, some property that it has, essentially, because it is leek green, all right? So this one, if you want to try to sort of cut it, you could put it on either list, but I thought it was more appropriate to name it after the second part of its name, because that is the source from which it was isolated. And then the last two on this list are actually just named after people, but they're named after compounds that were named after people. So once again, they're actually named after their source, and then it just so happens that that source is named after a particular person that was in charge or, relevant to the particular place where that particular ore was isolated, all right? So samarium comes from samarskite, which is named after a Russian mine official. Not a bad job if you become a mine official and an element ultimately gets named after you. And gadolinium comes from gadolinite or gadolinite, which was named after a particular Finnish chemist, all right? Okay, so those are a bunch of source elements. Let's talk about some elements that are named after a particular place, which you could argue is sort of just a kind of source. It's not a particular source compound, but it's a particular source location. One of them that I know you've heard of, but you probably didn't know, or maybe didn't know, comes from a particular source, and not just source, but region or country or area that it was originally associated with, is actually copper. Copper goes all the way back to ancient times, and in Latin it was known as ice cuprium. Ice just means metal or sometimes bronze or something like that. Cuprium just means Cyprian, which comes from the Greek word Kupros, which is just the island of Cyprus, which is located in the Mediterranean. Even back in ancient days, most copper was sourced from the island of Cyprus. So essentially, it was just named the Cyprian metal or the Cypriot metal, and that is where our word copper comes from today. Obviously, we have many more sources for copper other than the island of Cyprus, but this name goes back a couple thousand years, and that was the main place that they would get copper from way back in Greco-Roman times. As far as the other elements that are named after a particular region, none of the other ones on this list are going to go back that far. Copper is the only one that has an ancient name that goes back to some ancient place. Most of the rest of these were discovered fairly recently and then named for the place that they were discovered or the nationality of the person who discovered them. So for instance, gallium is named for Gaul, which is the ancient name for what is now France. It was discovered or isolated by a French person, which kind of makes sense. Germanium, named for Germany. Strontium, named for a village in Scotland. And then this is actually a great trivia question. There are 4 elements named for the same small little village in Sweden. Here they are. Yttrium, terbium, erbium, and ytterbium are all named for, and I'm not gonna try to pronounce this in the native Swedish, Ytterby, which is again a small village that is pretty close to Stockholm. As it turns out, there are a lot of ores that are gotten from that particular area, the area of that village, and they were able to isolate 4 different elements from that particular those particular ores, and then they were all ultimately named after forms of the name of that village. So that's actually pretty cool. 4 elements in one right there. Ruthenium was named for Ruthenia, which was a Latin name for Russia. Europium is obviously named for Europe. Holmium is named for another place in Sweden that I know you have heard of, Stockholm, because you can see the Holmia part there at the end of Stockholm. That is the Latin name for Stockholm. Thulium is particularly interesting. Thulium is named for a place called Thule. Now, if you look at your world map today, no matter how detailed it is, you're going to have a hard time finding the island of Thule. But in the ancient Mediterranean world, Thule was a semi-mythical island or landmass that was located far to the north. So if you go north through Europe and you hit some water and you cross it, you might find the island of Thule. Speculation about Thule goes back at least 2,500 years. The Greeks were talking about it a long time ago, back in the classical era, as just some remote northern island. There were rumors about it. Some people said that they had sailed there. Some of them were probably making it up. Some of them were probably telling the truth. It's not clear exactly where it was. Some people think it might have been Iceland. It might be that people somehow got blown off course and ended up way up in Iceland. Some people think that it was Scandinavia. When this element was named, it was named by someone in Scandinavia, and I think he was going for the Scandinavian Association, and he wanted to, give it a really cool name going all the way back to classical antiquity, so he named it after this mythical northern island that was known to people living in the ancient Mediterranean. Lutetium comes from the Latin Lutetia, which is actually just Latin for Paris, going all the way back to Roman times. And then finally, hafnium is from Hafnia. If that doesn't look familiar, that's just because it's the Latin name for Copenhagen, which of course is in Denmark. So you can see that these all make sense as elements that were named after a particular place that was associated with their discovery in some way. Let's talk about elements that were named for mythological figures. Like I said, there are 4 of these, and the first 2 are kind of a pair. They are palladium and cerium. They are both named for a Greek figure and a Latin figure, respectively, but interestingly, they're not actually directly named for those mythological figures. Rather, they are named for 2 asteroids that had been recently discovered when these elements were discovered. And those asteroids were in turn named for the mythological figures. So Pallas is another name for the goddess Athena in Greek mythology, and then Ceres is the name of the goddess of grain in Roman mythology, and she is equivalent to the Greek goddess Demeter. So once again, if you're wondering, what the connection is between Athena and Demeter and these 2 elements, there isn't actually really one. They weren't really named after those goddesses. They were named after asteroids that were recently discovered and named after those goddesses. There's a little bit more of a direct connection with the last 2 here. Promethium is pretty clearly named after the Greek character Prometheus. This was isolated fairly recently in the mid-20th century, and it was one of the first ones to be isolated along with technetium, and apparently the people who named this decided to name it after Prometheus because he is kind of an ambiguous figure in Greek mythology. On the one hand, he helps humans out. According to some versions of the story, he's actually the one who created humans in the first place. He steals fire from Zeus and brings it down to them, and then he gets chained up because Zeus gets mad at him for this, and he gets his liver pecked out by an eagle every day as he's chained to a mountainside. So he's really kind of an interesting character. On the one hand, he's a good guy. On the other hand, he's a rebel against the established order. And so it seems like they chose this name because they wanted to indicate that there can be both good and bad things about learning more about the elements and learning more about, of course, nuclear physics, which is what they were dabbling in at that time period. So there's an interesting message encoded in the name of the element promethium. There's also kind of an interesting message, maybe not quite as profound, encoded in the name of the element tantalum. Tantalum was named after another figure from Greek mythology named Tantalus. Now, Tantalus did some things to make the gods very mad at him, and so he was sent to Tartarus, which is basically the ancient Greek equivalent of hell, and he gets tortured every day down in Tartarus, but not tortured with fire or anything like that. Instead, he is standing in a pit of water, and there's a fruit tree growing right above him, and anytime he tries to grab the fruit from the fruit tree, the water goes down, and so he is unable to grab the fruit, so he stays hungry at all times. At the same time, anytime he tries to dip down and grab the water with his hands and drink it, it goes down, and so he can't grab the water. So he's always surrounded by water and fruit and everything he needs to survive. I guess they made him immortal at this point just to torture him, but everything he needs to be happy, but he can never get any of it. This is actually where we get our word tantalize from, and we talked about this in a previous episode, and I'll link to this, some words that we get from Greek mythology. So what's the connection between that particular individual and the element tantalum? Well, as it turns out, this element doesn't mix easily with other things, particularly acids, and so the discoverer named it tantalum because he was thinking of the story of Tantalus not being able to get any water into his system. So also this element apparently can't get things into its system. So it's an interesting connection that he made when he decided to name it tantalum. There are three elements that are really just named for similarity to some other element on the periodic table. Selenium is named after the Greek word selene, which means the moon, but it's not actually named after the moon. It's not named after any similarity to the moon. It's actually named after one of the elements that we were just talking about, which is tellurium. Remember, tellurium is the element named after the Earth, and so apparently there are a lot of similarities between these two elements. Selenium is right above tellurium on the periodic table, and so they, for lack of a better, source of inspiration, they just named it after tellurium. They named it after another thing that might go with it, which I guess they decided was the moon. So you have the earthy element and the moony element, and they kind of go together. Niobium, which is right above tantalum on the periodic table, is also named because of its close relationship to tantalum. We were just telling the story of Tantalus. He had a number of kids who were also famous and come into stories. One of them was a daughter, Niobe, who, again, you can look up her story, but the element really has nothing to do with her or her story. This element was named niobium strictly because of its similarity to tantalum, and we just talked about why that element got the name tantalum. Finally, molybdenum is actually just comes from the ancient Greek word for lead because it looks like lead. It's not lead, and if you've noticed, we haven't actually talked about lead because it's going to be on the next episode because it is higher up or really lower down on the periodic table, so we just won't be getting to it in this episode. But I know you know about lead, and this particular element apparently shares some properties with lead, and so it got a name that means leadish or leady or something like that. Okay, we've made it to the end. We have three more elements to talk about. These are elements that, once again, you have heard of, but that don't necessarily have satisfactory etymologies because their names are old, they were not recently named, and it's simply not clear where these names come from. The first one is silver. We all know about silver, right? Where does the word silver come from? This is another one of these relatively scarce elements that we did not borrow the name of from some other language or culture. It wasn't discovered recently. It goes all the way back to Old English and then Proto-Germanic before that. In Old English, it was a very similar word, sailivor. You can tell that we just, that's just a direct evolution from that Old English word. And that in turn goes back to Proto-Germanic, silavor. So really that word has not changed much in the English language in the past 2,500 years. We don't really know where this word comes from, and we definitely don't know what it originally meant. So it's really lost to history. There are some theories, and you can look into them, but I don't think anybody really knows for sure. If you're wondering where the symbol comes from, that symbol AG obviously has nothing to do with the word silver. That comes from the Latin word for silver, which was argentum. We get certain things like, the name of the country Argentina comes from this particular Latin word, so that's connected to the symbol AG. This was just the regular Latin word for silver, and we actually know where this comes from because it comes from an Indo-European root that means shiny, which, makes sense. It's a good word to name silver after. It's the shiny metal, essentially. But again, the actual word silver in English, we're not really sure what it would have originally meant. What about tin? Again, this is a pretty common metal. It's been known for thousands of years, and the word goes back to Proto-Germanic tinom. As you can see, that looks exactly like tin. It hasn't really changed much in the past couple of thousand years, but we don't really know what that meant. It's just a word they had, and it doesn't seem connected to other words. The Latin word for tin was stanum, and the symbol SN comes from that Latin word. Again, it doesn't really mean anything in Latin. It's just the name for tin. Finally, another element whose name is hotly debated and whose etymology is unclear is antimony. Antimony does come from the medieval Latin word antimonium, but it's not clear at all where this word came from. There are different theories floating around. It looks like it could come from two Greek words that mean the monk killer, which sounds super dramatic, so I guess we're all probably rooting for it to be true, but nobody really knows. The problem with that theory is that there were other elements and compounds that if you want to try to kill somebody, you would probably use those. Like arsenic is, as it turns out, more poisonous than antimony, so if you're going to try to kill a monk or anybody else, you'd probably use arsenic, and many people did. Another possible interpretation of this name is it's the element that doesn't like to be alone. Again, it's not clear why it would have gotten this name. There are some arguments in favor. In any case, in antiquity, they had a totally different word for this element that they were somewhat familiar with. The classical Latin word for this was stibium, and the symbol SB comes from that. One theory as to where our modern word for this element comes from is that it might ultimately go back to some of these Latin and Greek words that look like stibion or stibium or something like that, and that they might have gotten borrowed through Arabic, and then the Arabic put an al, that definite article, al, on the front of it, and then it ended up being garbled a little bit to al stibium, antimium, and then so you can kind of see how maybe our word comes from that ancient word stibium. By the way, the Romans and the Greeks probably got this word from Egypt. This was probably originally another Egyptian word, not our word antimony, but those classical words like stibium probably come from Egypt, and they are ultimately the source of that chemical symbol Sb. All right, that's all the elements in the middle of the periodic table, elements 26 through 73. Stay tuned for part 3, and we are going to tackle the last elements from number 74 on. See you then.